Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 2, Episode 4, Catch-Up Episode Number 2, Monster Movies. Sorry, I still feel like that's too many numbers in the title, but I don't have any better ideas. Anyway, this is the second episode in which I am catching up on the new sci-fi, admittedly mostly movies, that has come out since I started this podcast in 2020. No classics in this episode. I didn't have any on my list that fit. But in this one, I want to talk about the new monster movies that have come out over the past 2 years. So, when I started writing this script, I thought there were 4 major monster movies that have come out during the COVID era. And no, that's not necessarily comprehensive, but those are the ones I was aware of. But the thing is, the last movie I saw in theaters before COVID was The Rise of Skywalker. And that means I forgot to count a couple movies from early 2020. For one, there was The Color Out of Space, the Nicolas Cage adaptation of the classic H.P. Lovecraft story. That's not exactly a monster movie. It's horror, but the monster is more of an alien contagion. But it didn't really fit into any of my other categories, so I include it here. As it happens, I did watch that one on streaming while I was prepping my Lovecraft episode. And it was alright. Not stellar, but a decent popcorn flick. Then again, I'm not really one for horror movies. Even ones that don't rely heavily on jump scares, like Color Out of Space or Annihilation, don't really work for me. I actually find written horror to be more engaging, but even then I don't read a lot of it. Anyway, the second movie I missed in my initial count was Underwater, which, while not a direct Lovecraft adaptation, is still in the Cthulhu mythos, featuring Cthulhu and the Deep Ones as antagonists. But I never got around to watching that one. You might also count the 2020 version of The Invisible Man. Is it still a monster movie if the monster is actually human? In slasher movies, at least, I think it counts. And since it's technically a loose adaptation of the H.G. Wells story, it does count as sci-fi. But I didn't see that one either. Anyway, another part of the reason I missed these was that I was focusing more on giant monster movies, which only one of those 3 is. The big headline monster movie from the COVID era is probably Godzilla vs. Kong. 3 guesses what that one's about. Followed closely by Jurassic World Dominion. And in the case of Jurassic World Dominion, I did see it in theaters and I reviewed it on my blog, but it's still on the list for new monster movies, so I am mentioning it again here. Then, in addition to these 2, there was also the Monster Hunter movie and the post-apocalyptic comedy Love and Monsters. So, what can I say about these movies? I could talk about them and review them, but that doesn't feel right somehow. Not like in the previous catch-up episode. These are all recent wide-release movies. Even if they were released on streaming, they were still wide-release. And even if you haven't seen them personally, you can get reviews of major sci-fi movies anywhere. What's the point of talking about them here? What can I really bring to the table that's different? Well, I think if we're talking about sci-fi as a whole, the real question is, how do these movies fit into the genre? Or alternatively, what do these movies say about the direction of the genre? I named this podcast A Reader's History of Science Fiction for a reason, after all. To start out, let's go back to the Lovecraft stuff. Lovecraft's work has always enjoyed some low-key popularity. I think most sci-fi fans are familiar with it as foundational to the genre, but it's never been that heavily adapted by the major studios. It tends to be more indie stuff, from what I can tell. And yet, in 2020, Lovecraft went surprisingly mainstream with The Color Out of Space, Underwater, and the HBO series Lovecraft Country, which went even further afield and applied a modern take to the Cthulhu mythos by interrogating the original author's racist views. What does this mean for sci-fi? Lovecraft has never really been ignored, but these 3 are more big-name adaptations than I can remember seeing before. I think it would be interesting to see the Cthulhu mythos proper get wider play. Maybe not a cinematic universe per se, that feels like it would be a little like jumping the shark to me, but I'd be willing to consider it. However, it's hard to tell where it's going just yet. Especially with the chaos in Hollywood for the past 2 years, it's too early to tell whether 2020 was just a flash in the pan. On the flip side, Godzilla vs. Kong, and to a lesser degree Jurassic World Dominion, do illustrate the power of major franchises. But by that same token, I feel like that means they don't say as much about sci-fi as a whole. Godzilla vs. Kong in particular illustrates the ongoing power of these shared cinematic universes. In other words, it's all in the marketing. Of course, Godzilla was such a long-running series in Japan that the model was already there. For the record, I actually thought Godzilla King of the Monsters was a bit better. Godzilla vs. Kong was fun, but it felt a bit over the top. For one, since when is Godzilla that smart? I mean, maybe he is in the later Japanese movies, but at the end of the day, he is supposed to be an animal, isn't he? Also, I really don't know where they can go with the series from here. It seems like they've resolved the major conflicts, even though they're planning another movie and a TV show on Apple TV. Meanwhile, Jurassic World Dominion isn't part of a cinematic universe, but it is the finale of a long-running movie series. Ironically, even though the producers don't have plans for another movie, I feel like this one has a lot more potential. An Earth populated by dinosaurs living in something close to harmony with modern animals is a very big open world to play with. As I wrote in my review, the critics panned this movie, but I actually quite liked it. After lackluster showings in Jurassic Park 3, Fallen Kingdom, and in my opinion even Jurassic World 1, they finally managed to tell a new open-ended story and do it right, so I'd be happy to see more of that. On the other hand, the other real kaiju movie of the COVID era, Monster Hunter, felt much more bandwagon-y to me. Of course, it's based on a video game, which probably should have been the first red flag, but there are plenty of giant monsters in Hollywood, and these ones just weren't that memorable to me. It's just another monster movie. Also, the trailers lied, at least the ones I saw. The trailers made it look like the movie was about a stranded unit of the US Army fighting a desperate battle against the monsters, but instead the Army soldiers are all brutally killed in the first 30 minutes, except for one person who goes on to be the protagonist of the film. It just didn't work for me. Finally, we have Love and Monsters. This was a really interesting one. The premise is quite a bit different from the others to start with. It's about people trying to survive on a post-apocalyptic Earth overrun by monsters. But more than that, Love and Monsters is a comedy. And this is very much an oddity. You don't see many monster movie comedies. There are plenty of horror comedies. I could name 3 off the top of my head for zombies alone: Zombieland, Shaun of the Dead, and Warm Bodies. But I really had to dig to find giant monster movies that are comedies. Apparently Tremors is considered a comedy, and there's Eight-Legged Freaks, the musical version of Little Shop of Horrors, but there's really not that many. I suppose you could count Sci-Fi Channel B movies like Sharknado, but those aren't funny so much as campy. If you're not familiar, Love and Monsters is specifically about Joel, a survivor of the apocalypse who never leaves his bunker because he freezes uncontrollably at the sight of danger. But when he makes contact with his long-lost girlfriend over the radio, he gets fed up with staying inside and decides to make the seemingly impossible journey to reach her colony. And with the help of a couple of survivalists he meets along the way, he manages to blunder his way through and survive long enough to actually get good at it. So what does this say about sci-fi as a whole? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Monster movie comedies are rare, but they do happen. But Love and Monsters feels different from something like Tremors because it's actually trying to say something, with Joel's closing narration about not settling and going out and living your life in the new world. It feels a bit YA in that regard, but it pulls it off, and it got really good reviews. It's that kind of thing that can turn good sci-fi into great sci-fi. And raising the general quality of the genre is something of a win in itself. So maybe that's the clearest thing I can say about its legacy at this early stage. Also, while I'm on the topic of giant monsters, I should probably mention John Scalzi's new book, The Kaiju Preservation Society. I haven't read this one, but Scalzi is a good writer and it's gotten good reviews, so it's worth talking about. The Kaiju Preservation Society is also unique at this particular point in time, in that it is new enough to actually be set in the COVID era, talking about the challenges of getting by in a locked-down New York. The general premise is that the Kaiju Preservation Society watches over portals to a parallel universe where Earth is inhabited by enormous beasts fueled by biological nuclear reactors. Their mission includes making sure the kaiju are protected from greedy corporations, and also making sure they don't get loose on our side of the portals for obvious reasons. It sounds like a fun read, and perhaps one of the biggest proper literary World War Z style takes on the giant monster genre. Not the epistolary format, I mean the general literary treatment of a movie trope. And in fact, I've put it next on my own reading list, so I'll try to post a review of it in the near future. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available wherever you're listening to it right now, and probably on whatever website you prefer to listen to podcasts. Honestly, things are pretty standardized these days. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, and since we're talking about giant monsters, I should plug my video there again about the physics of giant monsters. I'm also on Twitter at SciMeetsFiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. For my movie recommendation for this episode, I'm actually going to recommend Love and Monsters. All of these movies are fun to varying degrees, even Monster Hunter if you know what you're getting into. But Love and Monsters is the one that really tells a new and different story and does a very good job of it, managing to be both funny and uplifting even in the apocalypse. In the next episode, to follow up the previous episode about constructed languages, I am pleased to announce that I will be interviewing Dr. Paul Frommer, the professional linguist who created the Na'vi language for Avatar, as well as Barsoomian for Disney's John Carter. For a professional look into the world of conlanging, be sure to check out that interview. Thanks for listening.